So let's go through the three-step process for Gabriella's guitar shop. The first step is to calculate the predetermined overhead rate before the period begins. Then we will allocate overhead to job 70 since job 70 is now finished. Allocating overhead to jobs means we will lower the manufacturing overhead account with a credit and add the overhead to the job's job cost record, which in effect increases work in process inventory. Then later we will adjust overhead either up or down so its balance is zero at the end of the year. Remember, it's a temporary account, so it has to be zeroed out at the end of the period. So let's do step one, which is to calculate the predetermined overhead allocation rate. And the formula for it is total estimated overhead cost for the period divided by total estimated quantity of overhead allocation base. And as we already mentioned in a previous video, Gabriella's guitar shop uses direct labor costs for its allocation base. So the formula becomes total estimated overhead costs divided by total estimated direct labor costs. So at the beginning of the period, the month of May in this case, Gabriella's accountant estimated that total overhead costs would be $3,200 for the month of May. As it turns out, at the end of the month, the actual overhead costs were $3,405. So the accountant had a pretty good estimate. But back at the beginning of the month, she also estimated that total direct labor costs would be $8,000. So now we just do the math and we find out that $3,200 divided by $8,000 gives us 0.40 or 40 cents. What this means is that for every 1 unit of the denominator, in other words, for every dollar of direct labor cost that a job had, the job would be allocated 40 cents of manufacturing overhead. You could also interpret the 0.40 as meaning multiply a job's direct labor cost times 40% to get the amount of manufacturing overhead it would be allocated. So the result of step one for Gabriella's guitar shop, which was 0.40, means that for every dollar of direct labor costs that a job had, 40 cents of manufacturing overhead would be allocated to the job's cost. Alternatively, instead of interpreting the 0.40 as 40 cents, you could interpret it as 40%. This would mean you would need to multiply the job's direct labor cost times 40% to get the amount of manufacturing overhead it would be allocated. Our next step is step two, allocate overhead to the job that just got finished, which is job 70, the double neck guitar. So let's go back to job 70's job cost record. We can now fill in this section of the job cost record. As we just calculated on the previous slide, the rate is 40% of DL costs. Remember, DL is direct labor. What this means is we take 40% of the total direct labor costs that the job had and add that as manufacturing overhead. So it looks like job 70 had $125 of direct labor. So we take $125 of total direct labor costs for this job, multiply it by 0.40 or 40%, to get $50 of manufacturing overhead that would be allocated to this job. An alternative way to think of this is, for every dollar of direct labor cost that this job had, it would get 40 cents of manufacturing overhead assigned to it. Now we can fill out the bottom part of the job cost record. Total direct materials was $275. Total direct labor was $125. And we allocated $50 of manufacturing overhead to job 70. So the total cost of job 70 is $450. And since the number of units was just one guitar, the unit cost is $450. Now Gabriella knows she needs to charge something more than $450 to earn a gross profit on this guitar. Now that we have allocated $50 of overhead to job 70, we need to update our journal and ledger, which are represented by our T accounts. Now that we have allocated $50 of overhead to job 70, we need to update our journal and we need to update our ledger, which is represented by our T accounts. To figure out the journal entry, it's often easier to see how the T accounts would be affected and then do the journal entry later. Remember, we have been accumulating overhead costs as debits in the manufacturing overhead account. Now that we have allocated costs to job 70, we need to lower or credit the overhead account. How much overhead did we allocate to job 70? $50 is seen here and here. So I'm going to credit the overhead account $50. Now we need a $50 debit. In which T account have we been putting the job cost records? That's right, we've been debiting the work in process inventory account. Now you can see that job 70 costs $450 according to the work in process inventory account and according to the job cost record. Now we can complete the journal entry to allocate $50 of manufacturing overhead. We do this by simply debiting work in process inventory, an asset that is increasing, and crediting manufacturing overhead, a temporary account that is decreasing. In a future video, we will learn how to adjust the manufacturing overhead account so that its balance is 0.